Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's Monday morning. I hope your week is starting off well. I've got a few quick things I want to throw at you to try to help you through some of this more challenging stuff. But first off, let me say to you that I know this material is hard. It's hard for everybody. It's hard for me. Uh, Part of the problem is this. It is a college level literature course, and in a college level literature course, this one or any other one, you're learning techniques that are designed to give a reader a greater intellectual insight into the material and how it works, and to give the reader the tools to draw deeper insights. Even if you like to read, taking a literature course in college is a different kind of reading. It's not the same thing. You don't just read for pleasure, but you read for insight and deepening vision. And so a college level literature course is designed to give you those tools. And typically, it certainly was the case for me, your first literature course in college is hard because you're learning a new way to read, a different way to approach the material. So I know that this material is particularly hard for, personal reasons for some of you, and I'll talk about that in a sec. So I know the material itself is hard, a literature course is hard, and I will be honest with you, my literature courses are designed to be challenging. Some of my colleagues disagree with my approach, some of my students don't like it, but I only know to do what I know to be good and true for my students. That's the best I can do. And so my literature courses are challenging. I mean, frankly, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't treat my college students, as adults with minds capable of insight and great wisdom, if provided the right amount of support and things. So I get that it's hard. And that's all I can say, And adding on to the end of that, in spite of the fact that it's difficult and challenging, I'm really appreciating the good faith efforts that many of you are making. I know some of you are really trying, and some of you have already achieved in 3 weeks a level of insight that is exciting and encouraging to me. So I know our work is working for many of you. The people who are going to quit in disgust, either because it's hard or because it's scary, they've pretty much already quit. So we're down to the fighting few, as I've talked about. So let me talk about some of the characters in Exodus. I gave you a video last week, where I talked about the kind of interesting mess that Exodus is in terms of the redaction and stuff. So let's talk about the way one approaches these characters, and I want to step outside of the biblical material for a moment and just pick, let's say, King Richard III of England. Well, we know there was really a Richard III. In fact, they recently found, in the last year or so, they found his body in a grave underneath a parking lot in England, and they've determined without a doubt that this is in fact Richard III. So Richard III was a real historical character. However, to say, okay, Richard III was a real historical character, end of discussion, not much else to talk about. When we read the play Richard III by Shakespeare, we are reading a literary characterization of Richard III. As far as we know, Shakespeare never knew Richard III, never had any kind of connection with him, and all didn't know the guy. So when Shakespeare writes a play about Richard III, Shakespeare has no knowledge of the actual historical figure. Shakespeare's writing an interpretation of Richard III's life, what he meant to history, how he may have acted in certain situations. And yes, those accounts in the play, which is probably my favorite Shakespeare play, those accounts are maybe based on actual historical accounts of people who were with Richard at the time and so forth. But Shakespeare was not there. Shakespeare had no knowledge directly of Richard III. So Who's the Richard III in Shakespeare? Well, it's a character that does have some historical precedent, but it's a character that Shakespeare's using to talk about the development of his nation, the history of his nation, how things moved from revenge to justice in his legal system, and so forth. So Shakespeare is using a historical figure whom he never knew to talk about the way his history and his culture developed. That's a fact. Shakespeare didn't know Richard III, but Shakespeare writes about a play. So to take the character of Richard III as being the same thing as the man himself is to make a mistake and to miss what Shakespeare's on about. So we're dealing with the same material here. If you wish to believe that Moses was an absolute historical figure, you have every right to believe that. But what you're dealing with, and you have every right to use this literature as confirmation of your belief system. That's not under discussion here. But what you're looking at from the point of view of a scholar of literature is you're looking at a literary portrait of a historical figure in exactly the same way that Shakespeare writes about Richard III. Whoever wrote about Moses is using the exact same principles, the same literary approach, and developing a quasi-literary figure based upon probably some historical precedents to talk about the culture, the way it developed, the way its laws developed, and so forth. So to say, okay, Moses existed absolutely as a historical figure, no doubt about it, you can say that if you want to, but ladies and gentlemen, that ends the discussion in terms of there's nothing more to be said in a literature class. Like I can say Richard III was an actual guy. Look, they found him buried in a parking lot in England. End of discussion. That ends the discussion about the guy, Richard III. But I can say, okay, let's take Shakespeare's play and let's look at the way Shakespeare wrote that character, and we can draw amazing insights about Shakespeare's view of his own culture and how he sees it developing and so forth and so on. Yeah, Richard III was a real guy. Okay. You want to say Moses was a real guy? Okay. But except that you're looking at a literary account that doesn't depend one way or the other on whether Moses was a real guy. Saying Moses was a real guy ends the discussion. Saying there's a literary portrait here, let's look at that portrait and try to draw insights about the subjective view of Moses, and the whole thing opens up. Again, I keep coming back to Gable's statement that taking a literary view of this material, looking at the subject, will liberate us. Insisting on the object, Moses was a real historical figure. End of discussion, nothing more to say. Okay? And you're welcome, again, you are welcome to say that if you wish to. You're welcome to believe whatever you wish to believe. It's fine. But that statement will end the discussion. Okay? Can't talk about Moses, but we can talk about the character, the portrait of Moses that appears in this material. All right. So I know some folks are still struggling about that, still wanting to talk about Moses as a real historical character. And by doing that, you're missing the opportunity to talk about the portrait of Moses in the literature, which is what we're here to talk about. Second thing, paper topics. I'm getting really excited about 2 or 3 of the paper topics you all have suggested. And I spent quite a bit of time with 3 or 4 of you, talking with you, working, trying to help you shape your paper topics in ways that I know will be successful. Again, part of what you're paying for in this class is my knowledge and expertise and training about what works and what doesn't. And I want all of you to succeed. And so I'm willing to do, an awful lot to try to help you shape those paper topics. And I appreciate that some of you are suggesting topics and asking for advice. It's not about me controlling what you write about. It's about me guiding you into a paper that will be successful in this class. I have no interest whatsoever in controlling what you write about. but I have a great deal of interest in helping you gain the knowledge that this class is designed to give you by writing papers that I can evaluate. I'm not a theologian. If you give me a theological paper, I can't evaluate it, and to ask me to do so is profoundly unfair. That's all I'm going to say about that. However, in terms of paper topics, for the folks who aren't suggesting paper topics, aren't even thinking about it, and aren't participating in that discussion, whatever my advice and expertise is worth, you're missing out on that. And I don't want you to be passive aggressive about this. Okay? Don't say, well, I didn't know what to write about, and I didn't ask any questions, and I didn't even think about any paper topics, and I didn't propose anything for discussion, and I didn't participate in the discussion. I didn't do anything to help myself, and so therefore it's a bad class, or he's a bad instructor, or whatever. The college is wrong to offer this class. Don't be passive aggressive. If you don't participate in the discussions, you don't allow our colleagues to help us forge a paper topic, and then you try to make that my fault or the fault of the class, you're being passive aggressive. It's not okay. This is college. You are adults. So I urge you to throw stuff out there, no matter how ridiculous, absurd it seems. If you give me something to work with, I will probably be able to help you. If you don't give me anything to work with, I won't. And if you don't give me anything to work with, and then you say it's my fault that you wrote a bad paper, that ain't going to wash, ladies and gentlemen. That just isn't wash. This is college. You're adults. Behave as such. And many of you are. And I appreciate, and I'm getting really excited about 2 or 3 things that I'm seeing starting to take shape. A paper topic for a class like this takes shape gradually. You mine out of all the possibilities, you mine out the 1 or 2 possibilities that are going to work for you. With my help, with your colleagues' help, with your own increasing sophistication. I've seen 2 or 3 people start with a very broad topic and narrow until they zero in right on something that's going to give them a chance to be successful. Okay? You need to do this. The papers due pretty soon. And if you don't let me help you, then don't be up in my face for not helping you. That's your choice. You've made that choice freely. All right, that was quite a sermon, wasn't it? Let me talk about 3, let's see, I can't read my notes here. So, in terms of the JEDP stuff, again, I want you to understand that's not that important. What's important is to develop the sensitivity to say, well, somebody wrote this and somebody else wrote that quite clearly. Obviously, logically, it's written by 2 different people. You don't really have to identify them by JED or P. That's just the shorthand that we use. However, let me point you to one section or a couple sections in Exodus where you can practice using your logical analytical skills to identify a source. And the goal is not to identify the source, although in this case it can be identified pretty clearly, I think. The skill we're after is not to identify the source accurately, but to say, well, this looks like this over here, so it's probably written by the same people, and it doesn't look like that, so it was written by someone different. That's simple logic based on the evidence in front of you. So if you if you read about some of these passages in Exodus that have these incredibly ornate descriptions of this temple and this tabernacle and the tent of meeting, all the gold overlay and the different kinds of wood that things are supposed to be made out of, and the exact dimensions of the thing and all that, it's interesting to talk about the sort of architectural blueprint of this tent of meeting, which becomes, of course, the prototype of the temple that gets built in Jerusalem. But when one is reading it carefully, one is struck with the fact that at the time of most of Exodus, the Israelites are wandering around in the Sinai desert. And all of this ornate gold overlay and the different kinds of woods and so forth, these are simply not available in the Sinai desert. They're not there. So, what can one say about this incredibly ornate direction? You're going to, you need this many overlays of gold and so forth. Well, okay, who would be interested in the construction of the temple? Who would be interested in creating the house of worship, the place where worship takes place? The priest, of course. The P source, of course. So you're reading an account, and if you take it as saying this is what they did while they were wandering in the desert, it's not possible. The materials were not there. And I know some people say, well, the Israelites took all their gold jewelry and melted it down, and okay, whatever. It doesn't make sense. It wasn't. The materials were not available. So from whence does this material appear? Well, I've built this great big fancy ornate place, and I like it because it's pretty and it's fancy and it gives me prestige. So I'm going to say, well, look, God told us to do this back over here. So it's quite clear if you think about it objectively. The subject, the priests, would be the ones who would be interested in this material, and who would then therefore create it, kind of like a backstory in literature. We have this great big fancy place. How did it get to be? Well, over here, we write the story. So you can identify that as the P source. There's no other possible source other than the P source. And again, identifying the P source is relatively unimportant, but looking at the material, looking at the evidence on the page in front of you, you can say these materials were simply not available. So where does this story come from? Insert it into the middle of this Exodus story. And you can identify that source. And that allows you to analyze the actual passage. Two other things. We also notice in the Exodus story, early on in the story of Moses, the Pharaoh wants all male Egyptian children thrown into the river. Kill all the sons of these people. And then later on, and that seems pretty unfair and unkind, but later on, we have the story where the God of the Israelites does the same thing. The God of the Israelites comes in and kills every firstborn Egyptian. So you've got a motif there of killing the firstborn. And you may say, well, Pharaoh's bad for doing that, and the Israelite God is good for doing that. I don't know. You say that if you want to, but is it possible that's what is being developed here is this idea of the second son being a survivor, as we talked about last week, the second son coming out on top, the firstborn son being taken out of the picture one way or another, which would allow children lower down the pecking order to come to prominence. Again, to say Pharaoh's bad for killing all the Egyptian firstborns and the Israelite God is good because he kills all the Egyptian firstborns, it doesn't make any sense. If you take it literally, if you take it as a motif that's being developed of this idea of the ascendancy of the second born son, then everything falls into place and you can make interesting and useful insights about why these stories are written the way they are. Again, to take them as literal history raises a whole set of problems that completely go away if you take them as literature. And the last thing is, and it's just a minor little thing, but a lot of you are starting to talk about symbols and imagery, which is really amazing because that's what we're supposed to be doing. But isn't it interesting to you that when at one point where Moses is being interrogated by the Pharaoh in the plague narratives, he throws down his staff and the staff becomes a snake. And then Moses reaches down and gets hold of the snake, and it turns back into a staff. Do you suppose there's any possible literary connection with that snake and the snake in the Garden of Eden? Do you suppose it might be the same source? Do you suppose it might be the same symbol, motif being developed? I mean, Moses could have, the writer could have had Moses perform any number of miracles to prove his primacy. But isn't it interesting, at least it is to me, that Moses proves his primacy, proves his control by taking control of a serpent. I've heard about serpents before, back in the other material, haven't I? Possible connection, possibly so. But that's the kind of symbolic work that you can do with this material if you're curious and able to sort of connect things. All right, so I do appreciate the efforts that many of you have been making. I respect and honor what you're doing. I know it's hard, and you must know for me that it's not any harder than it has to be. There's a lot of stuff that's really challenging and very, very difficult that we're frankly skipping right over because we don't have time and we possibly don't have the interest. So it's hard, but it's not any harder than it needs to be. Okay, so get those paper topics up. Let me help you. If you don't let me help you, then don't blame me. That's all I'm trying to say. Okay, that's it. Have a good week. I'll have the new stuff up tomorrow morning pretty early, I think, and we will talk some more. Bye.